A poor black girl was forced into marriage with an old man. At first, she was extremely reluctant and uncooperative, but after this happened, she completely changed her decision.
Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories your way. Thank you. Rent's due, Kiara. You got 3 days. The landlord's voice rang through the paper-thin walls, his tone sharp, impatient. Kiara sat at the small, wobbly dining table, a half-eaten bowl of instant noodles in front of her. She stared at the eviction notice clenched in her hand, the bold red print blurring before her tired eyes. 3 days. 3 damn days before she and her family would be thrown out on the street. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against her temples. Being broke was one thing. Being black and broke in this city? That was a whole different fight. Everywhere she turned, there was another obstacle. Another door slammed in her face. The med school loans were piling up. The waitressing job barely covered groceries. And now, her mother's hospital bills sat unopened on the counter, mocking her. Her mama's breathing had gotten worse last night, and Kiara had to pretend like she didn't hear the rattling in her mother's chest, like she wasn't terrified every time her mama closed her eyes. In the next room, Jamal, her 14-year-old brother, argued with Nia, her 7-year-old sister, over something stupid. Maybe the last piece of cornbread or whose turn it was to do the dishes. They had no idea how close they were to losing everything. A knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. It wasn't the landlord this time. She opened the door to find a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a face carved by years of hard work and harder living. Uncle Marvin. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year, and when he did show up, it was never good news. "Kiara," he greeted, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He glanced around at the cramped apartment, the flickering kitchen light, the pile of past-due bills stacked neatly on the counter. His lips pressed into a thin line. "You struggling bad, huh?" She crossed her arms, her body tense. "No more than usual. What do you want, Uncle Marvin?" He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like he was working up to something. "I got an offer for you," Kiara scoffed. "Unless it comes with a check big enough to cover rent, I don't want to hear it." Marvin's expression didn't change. "That's exactly what it comes with." She frowned. "What the hell you talking about?" He pulled out a chair and sat, his large hands resting on the table. "Jonah Harris," he said slowly, as if she should know the name. "Billionaire. Owns half the damn city. Man's sick. Real sick. Ain't got much time left. He's looking for a wife." Kiara's stomach twisted. "The hell does that have to do with me?" Marvin leaned forward. "He's willing to pay. A lot. You marry him, he takes care of you and your family. No funny business, just a legal agreement. When he passes, you walk away set for life." Silence stretched between them. Then Kiara burst out laughing. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." Marvin didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. "Kiara," he said, voice steady. "You about to be put out of this apartment. Your mama needs medicine. Them kids need a roof over their heads. You working yourself half to death for what? Some pocket change and a dream they won't even let you reach for?" She stood up abruptly, knocking the chair back. "I am not selling myself, Marvin. Ain't nobody saying you gotta lay up with the man." His voice was calm, but his eyes held something firm, something final. "He just needs a wife on paper. And you—" He motioned around the room, the piles of debt suffocating her from every direction. "You need a way out." Kiara's chest heaved, anger and humiliation burning beneath her skin. "I can figure this out," she snapped. Marvin sighed, slow and heavy. "You always was stubborn." He stood, his presence looming in the small space. "But time's running out, baby girl. You don't got many choices left." He slid a piece of paper across the table, an address scribbled in his rough handwriting. "Man wants to meet you," he said. "At least hear him out." Kiara stared at the address. The ink was smudged, like Marvin had hesitated before writing it. "This ain't the life you want," he said, softer now, "but it might be the only one you got." She didn't answer. Marvin sighed again and walked to the door, pausing just before stepping out. 3 days, Kiara." The door shut behind him with a finality that made her stomach turn. She sat back down, staring at the paper on the table. The address blurred and shifted before her eyes, but she didn't move to wipe the tears away. 3 days. She had 3 days to decide if she was desperate enough to sell her name to a dying man. Kiara sat in the back of the cab, hands pressed against her lap so hard her knuckles ached. The paper with the address still sat in her pocket, creased and damp from the sweat of her palms. She could have thrown it away. She could have walked away from this whole damn thing. But here she was. The car rolled past the wrought iron gates, and the world seemed to shift. The cracked sidewalks and graffiti-tagged buildings of her neighborhood felt like a lifetime away. Here, everything was clean, polished, untouched by struggle. Wealth had a way of making things look effortless. The mansion was something out of a movie. Grand columns, endless windows reflecting the overcast sky, a long driveway paved smooth like glass. But it didn't feel warm. It didn't feel lived in. It felt hollow. The cab driver whistled low as he pulled up. "Damn," he muttered, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "You sure you at the right place?" Kiara didn't answer. She just handed him the fare and stepped out, her heartbeat a slow, steady thud in her ears. Before she could knock, the heavy wooden doors groaned open, revealing a tall, sharp-looking man in a black suit. He nodded once, then stepped aside, silently inviting her in. The air inside was crisp, almost sterile, everything in its place, everything untouched. The butler, at least she assumed that's what he was, moved with practiced precision, leading her down a long hallway lined with expensive art. She didn't know much about paintings, but these looked like the kind that had been bought, not loved. Finally, they reached a set of double doors. The butler knocked twice, then pushed them open. Inside, seated behind a grand mahogany desk, was Jonah Harris. The first thing Kiara noticed was the stillness, the way he sat, upright, hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair, like a man who didn't waste movements. He was older, of course, had to be pushing 60, but there was a quiet strength to him, a presence that filled the room. His hair, once dark, was now streaked with silver, neatly combed back. His face was lined, not just with age, but with something deeper. Regret, maybe, or exhaustion. His eyes, sharp, blue, unreadable, lifted to hers. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice even, controlled. "Please, sit." Kiara swallowed, then lowered herself into the chair across from him. Silence stretched between them. The air smelled faintly of old books and something richer, whiskey, maybe, or expensive cigars long since put out. Finally, Jonah leaned forward, resting his hands together on the desk. "Marvin told you why you're here." It wasn't a question. Kiara's throat felt tight. "Yeah. And?" She let out a slow breath. "I ain't here to beg, Mr. Harris. If this is some kind of charity, it's not." His voice cut clean through her words, sharp, precise, not unkind, but firm. "This is a business arrangement, Miss Reynolds," he continued. "Nothing more, nothing less." Kiara crossed her arms. "Why me?" A flicker of something, amusement maybe, touched his face, but it was gone before she could name it. "Because I need someone reliable," he said simply. "Someone discreet. Someone with nothing to lose." Her stomach clenched at that last part. "You ain't got a woman from your world? Some socialite who'd love to slap your last name on hers?" Jonah exhaled through his nose. "You assume too much." Kiara frowned. He studied her, eyes steady, unreadable. "You're thinking I'm another rich old man looking for something to control, that this is about power." She didn't respond, but he wasn't wrong. Jonah leaned back slightly, tilting his head. "I don't have time for power plays, Miss Reynolds. I need a wife. On paper. A name to go beside mine, that's all." Kiara licked her lips, her mouth suddenly dry. "And what do I get?" Jonah didn't blink. "Security. For you. For your family. The bills will be paid. Your mother's care covered. Your brother and sister provided for." Her heart hammered against her ribs. It sounded too easy. Too simple. Jonah studied her, his gaze unwavering. "This is a transaction. Nothing more. You walk away from this marriage the same way you walked in, with your independence, but better off." The words settled heavy in the room. He reached for a folder on his desk and slid it toward her. "This contains the terms. Read it. Consider it. If you agree, we proceed. If not, you walk out that door, and we never speak again." Kiara stared at the folder, her pulse roaring in her ears. "You taking a risk too?" she murmured, finally meeting his gaze. Jonah nodded, just once. "We both are." She didn't know what to say to that. Slowly, she reached forward, taking the folder in her hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it already carried the weight of something permanent. She stood, her legs steady, even though her mind was anything but. Jonah didn't move, didn't say another word, just watched her with those cold, sharp eyes, like he already knew what her answer would be. Kiara turned and walked out of the office, the butler already waiting to escort her back to the door. When she stepped outside, the air was colder, the sky darker than before. She looked down at the folder, then back at the mansion. She didn't know what she should do. The folder sat untouched on the kitchen table for 2 days. Kiara had opened it once, skimmed the crisp black print, the legal jargon pressing down on her like a weight. A marriage on paper. A contract, not a commitment. Every detail spelled out in precise language. Financial provisions for her family, medical care for her mother, an ironclad agreement that after Jonah Harris passed, she would walk away with enough money to never struggle again. It should have been an easy decision, but easy didn't mean simple. At night, she lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling of their tiny apartment, listening to the faint wheezing of her mother's breath from the other room. 3 days ago, she had no choices. Now she had one, and it scared her more than having none at all. By the morning of the 3rd day, there was nothing left to think about. She signed the contract. The wedding was nothing more than a transaction. No white dress, no vows spoken from the heart, just signatures on paper, a brief nod from the judge, and the weight of a new last name that didn't quite belong to her settling onto her shoulders. Jonah Harris stood beside her in the courthouse, his posture straight, his face unreadable. He wore a charcoal suit, pressed and perfect, like the entire event was just another business meeting. The only witnesses were a lawyer and the butler, Mr. Calloway, who'd been the one to pick her up that morning and drive her to the courthouse in a sleek black car that smelled of leather and quiet money. Jonah didn't touch her, didn't so much as glance at her when the judge pronounced them husband and wife. And when it was done, when the papers were filed, and her life no longer belonged to her alone, Jonah finally spoke. "I'll have Calloway take you to the house," he said, his voice as even as ever. "Your things will be moved in by the evening." Just like that, no welcome, no pretense of warmth, just a quiet acceptance that this was how it was going to be. And Kiara, sitting stiffly in the back seat of the car as it pulled away from the courthouse, couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just sold a part of herself she wasn't sure she'd ever get back. The mansion didn't feel any warmer the second time she saw it. It was still grand, still lifeless. A house, not a home. Mr. Calloway guided her inside, past the towering staircases and endless halls, into a room at the far end of the house. "This will be your space, ma'am," he said, setting her suitcase down by the wardrobe. "If you need anything, Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper, is always available." Her space, not their space. Not a wife's place beside her husband, but a separate corner of the house meant to contain her. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Calloway left, closing the door with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. Kiara sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the neatly made sheets, the expensive furnishings, the walls that felt like they belonged to someone else. What the hell had she done? Jonah didn't come to find her. The first day passed in silence, then the second. She saw him only in passing, at breakfast, where he sipped his coffee in silence while reading the paper, and at dinner, where he sat at the far end of the long dining table, making polite but distant conversation about the household schedule and expectations. He never asked about her, never brought up the contract, never gave her anything beyond the surface. She told herself she didn't care. But on the fourth night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the quiet pressed in too heavy, too suffocating. She needed air. The house was dark as she padded barefoot down the grand staircase, the marble cold beneath her feet. The chandeliers cast soft pools of light, and for the first time, she noticed how quiet the house really was. No music, no voices, no life. In the sitting room, she found the piano. It was sleek, black, untouched. She traced a finger over the keys, pressing down lightly. A single note echoed through the stillness, breaking the silence like a ripple in still water. "I didn't take you for a musician." Kiara jumped, turning sharply. Jonah stood in the doorway, watching her. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, unreadable in the dim light. She swallowed, pressing her hands against her sides. "I used to play," she said. Jonah stepped into the room, moving slow, deliberate. "Why'd you stop?" Kiara shrugged. "Life got in the way." He didn't answer, just studied her like he was trying to piece something together. Then, to her surprise, he moved toward the piano. Slowly, he reached out, pressing his fingers against the keys. A deep, rich chord filled the air, resonating through the emptiness. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked different. Not softer, exactly, just less contained. His hands lingered on the keys before he pulled away, his mask slipping back into place. "It's late," he said, stepping back. "Get some rest." And just like that, the moment was gone. Kiara watched as he left, disappearing down the hall, his presence fading into the silence of the house once more. The house had a way of swallowing sound. Even in the daylight, it carried a kind of quiet that felt unnatural. The weight of too much space and too few voices pressing against the walls. Kiara wandered through the halls, letting her fingers graze the polished wooden railings, the intricate carvings on the door frames. She still wasn't sure if she belonged here. This place wasn't hers. It never would be. It was his. A world built long before she entered it, one that seemed to have no room for her. But she was here now. And for however long this arrangement lasted, she needed something to make the silence bearable. That was when she found the room. The door was slightly ajar, the dim light of the late afternoon spilling into the hall. Inside, the air was cooler, filled with the faint scent of aged wood and something else, something familiar. Music. The grand piano sat in the center of the room, its dark surface gleaming beneath the chandelier's soft glow. It was beautiful, untouched, like everything else in the house. Kiara hesitated. It had been years since she last played, since life had stripped away little luxuries like music, like the time to sit and let her fingers move freely over the keys. She stepped closer, heart pounding lightly against her ribs. She shouldn't, but then, why not? Tentatively, she lowered herself onto the bench, running her fingers along the cool ivory keys. It felt like touching a memory. She pressed down, letting a single note drift into the air, then another and another. A simple melody, soft and uncertain, the kind of song she used to hum to Nia when she was little, back when things were simpler. She closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the music, into the one thing in this house that felt familiar. Then a voice cut through the air. "You play." Kiara's fingers froze. She turned sharply, heart lurching into her throat. Jonah stood in the doorway, watching her. His expression was unreadable, those sharp blue eyes locked onto hers, not in anger, not in judgment, just something quiet, observing. Kiara swallowed. "I used to." Jonah stepped inside, his movements slow but deliberate. His posture was as rigid as ever, but there was something different in his face, something that softened the edges. "You should keep going," he said. She frowned. "You ain't mad?" He shook his head. "No." It was the first time he had ever given her such a direct answer. Hesitating, she turned back to the piano, her fingers brushing against the keys. She played again, this time letting the melody flow a little easier, a little fuller. Jonah walked farther into the room, standing near the bookshelves that lined the walls. She could feel his gaze on her, but he didn't speak, didn't interrupt. When she finished, the last note lingering in the air, she glanced at him. "You play?" Jonah's lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. "I did, a long time ago." Kiara studied him. It was rare for him to share anything about himself, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. "Why'd you stop?" For the first time since she met him, Jonah hesitated. He moved toward the piano, his fingers grazing the polished surface. "There was someone," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "She was a pianist." Kiara straightened slightly. Jonah didn't look at her when he spoke. His eyes were on the piano, but his mind was somewhere else. "She used to play every night," he murmured, "in this very room." There was something in his tone that made Kiara hold her breath, a grief that had settled deep, worn into him like an old wound. "What happened?" she asked. Jonah's fingers curled slightly against the wood. Then he exhaled, stepping back. "I let her go." Silence stretched between them. Kiara didn't push. She could see it in his face, the weight of a story too painful to speak aloud. She looked down at the keys again, pressing them lightly, filling the space between them with sound instead of words. Jonah stood there for a moment longer. Then, without another word, he turned and left. The room felt colder without him in it. But for the first time since she arrived, it didn't feel empty. The days passed, and something between them shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. But Kiara felt it. The way Jonah lingered a little longer at the dinner table. The way his eyes softened, just slightly, when he watched her from across the room. The way he didn't seem to mind when she played the piano in the evenings. They weren't friends, not yet. But the silence wasn't as heavy anymore. And then she started noticing something else. Jonah was getting weaker. At first, it was just small things. The way he paused when getting up from his chair. The way his fingers sometimes trembled when he reached for his glass. But as the days stretched into weeks, it became harder to ignore. His steps were slower, his breath heavier. And one night, as they sat in the dining room, she saw it happen. Jonah reached for his fork, but his grip faltered. The metal clattered against the plate, loud against the quiet. Kiara's stomach twisted. He was sick. She had known that, had signed the contract knowing that.
But seeing it, seeing the way his body betrayed him, the way he straightened quickly, trying to pretend it hadn't happened, that was different. The weight of the silence lingered long after the sound of the fork hitting the plate had faded. Jonah had barely reacted, straightening his posture, continuing his meal as if nothing had happened. But Kiara had seen it. That brief hesitation, the fleeting frustration in his eyes before he forced himself back into control.
He was a man who refused to show weakness, who carried himself with an air of quiet authority, but for the first time, the cracks were starting to show. She didn't say anything then, didn't press him about it during dinner. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the image wouldn't leave her. She had known the truth, had agreed to this arrangement fully aware that Jonah Harris was not a man who would live long enough to see the end of the year. But knowing something in theory and seeing it unfold before her were two entirely different things. Sleep wouldn't come, no matter how many times she turned onto her side or pulled the covers tighter around herself. The house was too quiet, the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her. Frustrated, she got up, wrapping her robe around her before stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The air was still, the kind of silence that made the house feel abandoned despite its grandeur. She wasn't sure where she was going until she found herself standing in front of Jonah's study. The door was slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling into the hallway. She hesitated, debating whether she should turn around, but something told her that whatever she was about to find, she needed to see it. She pushed the door open. Jonah was seated behind his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring into the dim light of the fireplace. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't seem surprised to see her standing there in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire burning low. "You're up late," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "So are you," she replied, stepping further into the room. He exhaled, setting his glass down on the desk. His fingers lingered around the rim, thoughtful, like he was weighing something in his mind. And then, finally, he met her gaze, and for the first time since she had moved into this house, Kiara saw it, the exhaustion, the weight he had been carrying alone. "I suppose it's time," he murmured. She frowned slightly. "Time for what?" Jonah leaned back, the firelight casting shadows across the lines of his face. "For you to know the truth." Her stomach tightened. "I thought I already did," she said carefully. The contract, Jonah interrupted, his voice even but firm, was just the surface. There was something final in the way he said it, something that made Kiara's pulse quicken. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching hers, before he finally spoke the words that made her stomach drop. "I'm dying, Kiara." The air in the room shifted, as if something invisible had settled between them, pressing down on her chest. She had known. Of course she had known. It was written in the contract, spelled out in ink on paper, the unspoken truth behind their arrangement. But hearing him say it, seeing the way his hands curled slightly against the armrest, as if steadying himself for her reaction, that was different. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah held her gaze, and for once, there was no barrier between them, no carefully placed distance. "Months, maybe less." She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "Is that why you married me?" Jonah nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Part of it." He looked away then, his gaze drifting toward the fire, the flickering light reflecting in his sharp blue eyes. "I built this life from nothing," he said, his voice quieter now, more reflective. "Spent years chasing success, making a name for myself, but in the end, what does it mean? Money doesn't change what's coming. Power doesn't keep your hands from shaking." His fingers trembled slightly as if proving his own point, and Kiara found herself staring at them, the small, undeniable proof that he was not as invincible as he had once seemed. Jonah exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "I didn't want a wife, Kiara. Not in the way people think. I wanted someone I could trust, someone who wouldn't look at me with pity, someone who'd understand that this isn't about love or companionship." Kiara felt her breath catch in her throat. "Then what is it about?" Jonah's gaze found hers again, unwavering. "Legacy," he said simply. "I wanted to leave something behind that mattered. Not just wealth, not just a business, something real." She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to process the fact that he had chosen her to be the one thing that remained after he was gone. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with things neither of them knew how to say. Kiara looked at him then, really looked at him. Not as the untouchable billionaire, not as the cold and distant man who had made her his wife out of convenience, but as someone who had spent his entire life building an empire, only to realize that none of it could save him. She should have walked away. Should have reminded herself that this was a business arrangement, that she was here for the money, for her family, for the security this deal would bring her. But something inside her cracked, and before she could stop herself, she stepped forward, hesitating only a moment before reaching out. Her fingers brushed against his, the briefest touch, barely there, but enough to let him know she was still standing in front of him. The next days, Jonah was fading. Kiara saw it in the way he moved, slower, measured, as if every step required effort he refused to acknowledge. She saw it in his face, the color drained from his skin, the sharpness in his eyes dimming ever so slightly. Some days he hardly left his study. Other days, he sat in the garden, staring out at the world like he was memorizing it. She didn't ask if he was in pain. She already knew the answer. Instead, she stayed close. Not in a way that smothered him, not in a way that made him feel like an invalid, but in small, quiet ways. She made sure his tea was warm in the mornings, that the meals were something he could stomach, that the house felt lived in, even when he no longer had the strength to walk through it. But mostly, she listened. One morning, she found him in the sitting room, a book open in his lap. He wasn't reading it. His fingers rested lightly on the pages, unmoving. She leaned against the doorframe. "You've been holding that book for an hour." Jonah glanced at her, a small smile playing at the edges of his mouth. "I'm learning to appreciate the moment." Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. She crossed the room and sat beside him, but she didn't press for more. Some things didn't need to be said aloud. The distance between regret and peace. One evening, they sat outside, the summer air thick with the scent of earth after rain. Jonah leaned back on the wooden bench, his breathing slower than usual. The quiet stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that meant something. "I had a chance," Jonah said finally, his voice low, reflective. "To have a family. A real one." Kiara turned to him, waiting. "But I was too caught up in chasing something I thought mattered more," he continued. His gaze was distant, fixed on something she couldn't see. "I built an empire. I made more money than I could ever spend. And in the end, I have this." He gestured at the house, the vastness of it, the emptiness. She knew what he meant. "That woman," Kiara said softly. "The pianist." Jonah nodded once, his expression unreadable. "She wanted a home. I wanted the world. By the time I realized they weren't the same thing, she was gone." He exhaled, the sound barely more than a whisper. "I've spent a long time wondering what my life would have looked like if I had chosen differently." Kiara didn't know what to say. What was there to say to a man running out of time, looking back at the road he'd never taken? Instead, she reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, the evening wind carrying the weight of unspoken things between them. The last letter. A few days later, Jonah asked for paper and a pen. Kiara watched as he settled at his desk, his hands unsteady, but his focus sharp. She didn't ask what he was writing. She already knew. She sat nearby, listening to the faint scratch of the pen against the paper, the sound strangely comforting. He wrote slowly, pausing every so often to rest, to gather his thoughts. He was weaker than he had been even a week ago, but there was a quiet determination in him, a need to finish this one last thing. When he was done, he set the pen down, exhaling deeply. "It's finished," he said, his voice filled with something close to relief. Kiara stepped forward, but she didn't take the letter. She let him hold on to it a little longer. Jonah looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Kiara." She waited. "You changed things," he said simply. "More than you know." Her throat tightened. He handed her the letter. His handwriting was smaller than she expected, more careful. Inside, she knew, were the things he hadn't been able to say aloud. "Kiara," it read, "you helped me remember that money is not the most valuable thing in this world, but the people we leave behind. Use what I'm giving you to build something meaningful. I trust you will." She ran her fingers over the ink, tracing the words, feeling their weight. Jonah let out a slow breath. "That's enough for tonight." And Kiara, blinking back the sting in her eyes, nodded. "Yeah, that's enough." The last night. It rained that night. A soft, steady drizzle that tapped against the windows, filling the house with a quiet rhythm. Kiara carried a cup of tea to Jonah's room, expecting to find him asleep. Instead, he was sitting by the window, staring out at the garden. She placed the cup beside him, but he didn't move to take it. Instead, he looked at her, something unspoken in his gaze. "Thank you, Kiara." Her chest tightened. "For what?" Jonah's lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. "For being here." She swallowed hard. "You don't have to thank me." But he did. She saw it in his eyes. She reached for his hand, just as she had in the garden, and he let her. For a long time, they sat there, listening to the rain, the quiet breathing between them the only proof that time hadn't stolen everything just yet. And that was the last conversation they ever had. The morning came with an eerie stillness, as if the house itself sensed what had happened before Kiara even knew. She moved through the kitchen with routine precision, brewing coffee, toasting bread, scrambling eggs, going through the motions the way she had for weeks. The scent of breakfast filled the air, a familiar comfort, but something felt off. She couldn't name it at first, just a quiet unease curling in her stomach, a heaviness in the air that made her pause for half a second before shaking it off. Jonah would be waiting. She balanced the tray carefully and made her way upstairs, listening to the soft creaks of the old house, the subtle sounds that had become so familiar to her. When she reached his door, she knocked lightly. Silence. She frowned and knocked again, a little louder this time. "Jonah?" Nothing. The unease in her chest tightened into something sharper. Carefully, she pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, curtains still drawn, but enough light filtered through to cast soft shadows across the bed. Jonah lay still, his face turned slightly toward the window. He looked peaceful, his features relaxed in a way that was almost deceptive. For a brief moment, she thought he was just asleep, that maybe he had finally managed to rest without pain. Then she saw his hand, resting on top of the blanket, fingers slightly curled but unnaturally still. A cold prickle ran down her spine. She set the tray down on the nearest table, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped closer. "Jonah?" Her voice was softer now, almost hesitant. He didn't stir. She reached out, barely breathing, and touched his hand. Cold. Her stomach twisted violently. She pulled back, but the truth had already sunk in. He was gone. The moment stretched, heavy and unmoving. She stood there, staring down at him, waiting for something, anything, to make it feel real. But there was nothing. No dramatic realization, no breaking down into sobs. Just a quiet, aching stillness as she sank onto the edge of the bed and let out a slow, shuddering breath. She had known this day was coming. She had signed a contract knowing this would happen, but knowing didn't soften the blow. She wasn't ready. She would never be ready. The house felt different after that. It was still as grand, still as vast, but something had shifted in its walls. The staff moved quietly, their usual routines now tinged with an unspoken grief. Mr. Collins, the butler, stood by the staircase with a rigid posture, his face unreadable, but Kiara caught the way his hands clenched behind his back. Mrs. Porter wiped her eyes discreetly with the edge of her apron when she thought no one was looking. She hadn't realized how much Jonah had meant to them. She hadn't realized how much he had meant to her. She handled the arrangements as he would have wanted, without excess, without spectacle. The service was private, attended only by those who had known him as a man rather than as a billionaire. There were no reporters, no investors seeking to make an appearance, just the few people who had truly mattered in his life. Kiara stood among them, hands clasped, her expression calm, even as something inside her felt like it was unraveling. She didn't cry during the service. She sat through it, listening to the quiet words spoken in his memory, nodding when necessary, thanking those who came. It all felt surreal, like watching a moment unfold from outside of herself. It wasn't until she was alone again that it finally hit her. That night, she found herself in the music room, drawn there without thinking. The piano stood untouched, gleaming beneath the dim light, waiting in the same way it always had. She sat down, running her fingers lightly over the keys. Jonah had never played, but he had loved music. She had seen it in the way he listened, in the way his fingers traced the piano's surface, as if remembering something long lost. She pressed down on a single key, then another, and another. The melody came slowly, hesitantly, filling the empty space where he used to be. She played for him, for the quiet moments they had shared, for the words left unspoken. When the last note faded into silence, she reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out the letter he had left for her. The paper was smooth beneath her fingers, the handwriting careful, deliberate. "Kiara," it read, "you helped me remember that money is not the most valuable thing in this world, but the people we leave behind. Use what I'm giving you to build something meaningful. I trust you will." She read it twice, then a third time, and finally, the tears came. Not in heavy sobs, not in loud cries, just quiet, steady tears that fell onto the piano keys as she clutched the letter in her hands. She had never told Jonah what he had meant to her, never found the right words, the right moment. But as she sat there, surrounded by the echoes of the life he had left behind, she hoped, somehow, that he had known. The house felt different now. Jonah was gone, yet his presence lingered in the walls, in the spaces he once occupied, in the quiet moments Kiara spent wandering through the grand, empty halls. The air was still, the silence stretching longer than it ever had before. But it wasn't the same hollow silence she had felt when she first arrived. It was something else, something waiting. A week had passed since the funeral, yet Kiara had barely stepped foot outside the estate. The weight of what Jonah had left her sat heavy on her shoulders. Not just the money, not just the house, the responsibility. She sat in his study, the very place where he had told her the truth about his illness, the place where he had written his last words to her. The envelope still lay on the desk, though the letter inside had been read so many times, the creases had begun to wear. Kiara traced her fingers over the edges of the paper. "Use what I'm giving you to build something meaningful." She exhaled slowly. She had never cared about money, had never dreamed of living in a mansion or having more than she needed to survive. But Jonah had given her something more than just wealth. He had given her a choice, and choices had power. The idea came slowly, creeping in at the edges of her thoughts until it was all she could think about. The mansion was too big for one person, too empty to serve no purpose beyond being a monument to Jonah's wealth. He had spent his life building an empire, but in the end, he had wanted something more. And she understood that now. She thought about the people she had grown up with, the ones who had never been given a fair chance. The kids like her, who had spent their childhoods balancing school and survival. The families who struggled to keep a roof over their heads. The ones who worked themselves to the bone and still came up short. This house, this gift, could be something more than just a place to live. It could be a place to change lives. Kiara spent the next few weeks making phone calls, reaching out to organizations, connecting with people who could help her turn this idea into reality. She met with community leaders, spoke with educators and social workers, sat in on meetings she never imagined herself being a part of. She was stepping into a world she had never belonged to before. But she refused to back down. By the time the plan was finalized, the house was no longer just an estate. It was a community center, a place where people could come to learn, to grow, to find opportunities they had never been given before.
There would be free education programs, financial assistance, career guidance, a second chance for those who needed it. A second chance, just like Jonah had given her. The first person Kiara told was her mother. She had recovered enough to walk without struggling, her once frail frame now stronger with each passing day. When Kiara explained what she wanted to do, her mother simply nodded, pride shining in her tired eyes. "I'll help with the kitchen," she said. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Adam, her younger brother, had always been restless, never quite sure where he fit in the world. But when he heard about the center, something shifted in him. "I can run programs for the teens," he offered. "Help keep them off the streets. Make sure they don't go down the wrong path."
And then there was Nia, her sweet, bright-eyed little sister, who had spent her childhood drawing pictures on scraps of paper, dreaming of things bigger than their reality. She picked up a paintbrush without hesitation. "We should make the walls pretty," she said, already envisioning murals that would bring the space to life. Together, they built something real. The center opened exactly 1 year after Jonah's passing. The grand staircase that had once felt like a barrier now stood as an entryway for those who had never been welcomed in places like this before. The dining room that had once been eerily quiet now hummed with laughter and conversation. The once empty halls were filled with movement, with life, with purpose. The gala was held in the main hall, the chandeliers casting a warm glow over the gathering. It wasn't an event filled with elites or business moguls. It was for the people who mattered, the ones Jonah would have wanted to be there. Kiara stood on stage, microphone in hand, looking out at the crowd. Faces of those she had helped, those who had worked alongside her to make this possible, those who had become part of this journey. She took a breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "When I first came to this house, I didn't belong here." Her voice was strong, unwavering. "I was just a girl trying to survive, trying to keep my family afloat. Jonah Harris gave me something I never thought I'd have. A future." She turned slightly, her gaze falling on the framed portrait of Jonah placed at the entrance of the hall. He was watching over this place, over her, in a way that he never had before. She smiled softly before continuing. "Legacy isn't about how much money you leave behind," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "It's about the lives you change, the people you lift up, the opportunities you create for those who never had them before." She gestured toward the center around them. "This is Jonah's legacy, and I promise I will carry it forward." The room filled with applause, but Kiara barely heard it. Her heart was steady, her purpose clear. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly where she was meant to be. That night, after the last guest had left, and the house had settled into a peaceful stillness, Kiara found herself back in the music room. She sat at the piano, running her fingers over the keys, feeling the weight of everything that had led her to this moment. She thought of Jonah, of his last words to her, of the way he had trusted her with something greater than herself. She played a soft melody, one that carried no sadness, only gratitude. And then, as the final note faded, she whispered, "Thank you, Jonah. I won't let you down." She stood, taking one last look around the room before stepping out into the night. The future was waiting. Kiara's journey is one of transformation, resilience, and purpose. She begins as a struggling young woman burdened by responsibility, forced into a marriage of convenience with a man she barely knows. What starts as a cold arrangement slowly evolves into something deeper. Not romantic love, but a profound connection built on understanding, loss, and redemption. Jonah, a man who spent his life accumulating wealth but lacking true companionship, finds solace in Kiara's presence. Through their time together, Kiara learns that wealth is meaningless without purpose, and Jonah finds peace in leaving behind something greater than himself. His passing is not just an end, but a catalyst for Kiara to redefine her life's meaning. The most powerful lesson in this story is that legacy is not measured by riches, but by the impact we have on others. Kiara's decision to turn Jonah's mansion into a community center symbolizes the idea that privilege should be used to uplift those in need. This story reminds us that even in the face of tragedy, redemption is possible. Kiara's growth teaches us that true fulfillment comes not from personal gain, but from creating opportunities for others, turning loss into hope and hardship into purpose. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.